Have you ever wondered what it's like to be sitting in a room, knowing that millions of people are waiting for you to say something interesting, and feeling that you have absolutely nothing really relevant to say? Chris Broussard knew that sensation very well. On that day in May of 2019, sitting in the Fox Sports studio in Los Angeles, the air conditioning hummed quietly while he reviewed his notes. The smell of cold coffee mixed with the characteristic odor of electronic equipment filled the environment. His hands were sweating slightly. The pressure was palpable, almost physical, like an invisible weight upon his shoulders. It is impossible not to feel it when you desperately need to be relevant. The truth is that the world of sports journalism had changed. It was no longer enough to simply report facts. It was not sufficient to merely analyze games. Social media had transformed everything into an endless race for attention. Every commentator, every analyst, every journalist was fighting for the same thing: that viral clip, that tweet that would be shared thousands of times, that punchy phrase that would make people talk. And Chris knew this better than anyone else. 3 minutes until we go live, announced Marcus Williams, the producer, through Chris's earpiece. The voice had that tone of urgency disguised as professional calm. Chris breathed deeply. Over the last few months, he had felt something changing. The audience numbers were no longer the same. His Twitter was not generating the same engagement. Other analysts, younger ones, with more extreme opinions, were gaining space. Stephen A. Smith was screaming. Skip Bayless was provoking. Nick Wright was building controversial narratives. And him? Chris Broussard was becoming forgettable. You can perceive that this sensation of losing relevance is suffocating, can't you? Like sand slipping through your fingers. The more you try to hold on, the faster it escapes. That afternoon, the subject was obvious. The Golden State Warriors were destroying the Portland Trail Blazers in the playoffs. But there was a detail that was making everyone talk. Kevin Durant, the two-time finals champion, the team's star, was injured. Out since the second game against the Houston Rockets. And the Warriors? They were playing perhaps better without him. 2 minutes, Marcus warned. Chris looked at his notes. He had statistics. He had tactical analyses. He had everything a good journalist needed. But something inside him whispered, "This is not enough. This will not make anyone stop to listen. This will not go viral." The temperature in the room seemed to drop. Or perhaps it was just anxiety freezing his veins. That's when the idea emerged. Dangerous, tempting, irresistible. What if he made a stronger statement? What if he not only analyzed, but revealed something personal? What if he suggested that he knew intimately what Kevin Durant was feeling at that moment? 1 minute. Chris's heart accelerated. He had exchanged some messages with Kevin Durant in the past. Direct messages on Twitter, on Instagram. They weren't exactly intimate conversations, but they were something. They were a connection, an access. What if he used that to give weight to his opinion? Big decisions are made in seconds of impulse. Did you know that? 30 seconds. Chris adjusted his suit, ran his hand through his hair, breathed deeply one more time. That cold feeling in the stomach that everyone knows when they're about to do something that could go very right or very wrong. We're on air in 5, 4, 3. The studio lights turned on with that characteristic intensity. The heat was immediate, almost aggressive on the skin. Chris looked directly at the camera. His reflection in the monitor showed a confident man. But inside, there was something different. There was hesitation. There was a whisper of warning that he chose to ignore. "Good morning, everyone," Chris began with that professional voice he had perfected over the years. Today, we're going to talk about something I believe is Kevin Durant's worst nightmare. Worst nightmare. The words came out with force, with conviction, with the certainty of someone who knows exactly what they're talking about. The Golden State Warriors are flying without Kevin Durant in the playoffs, and what impresses me most is how the team seems free, more dynamic, more connected. Stephen Curry has become the protagonist again. Draymond Green is commanding. And do you know what that means? Chris made a dramatic pause, that calculated silence that every communicator knows. It means that if the Warriors win the championship this year without Kevin Durant, those 2 rings of his, those 2 championships he won with Golden State, are going to start having an asterisk. People will question, did they really need him? Was he really essential? The adrenaline was rushing through Chris's veins. He could feel it. This was good. This was strong. This was going to generate conversation. But then he crossed the line. And look, I know Kevin. I know how he thinks. We talk. We exchange messages. I can say that for a player of his caliber. Watching your team win without you. Seeing people questioning your importance. That's devastating. It's the worst nightmare of any elite athlete. Done. It was done. Chris continued talking for a few more minutes, elaborating his theory, building his narrative. But those words were already out there, floating in the digital universe, ready to be cut, shared, dissected. When the studio lights went off, Chris stood up. His legs were a little trembling. He didn't know if it was from excitement or from something more concerning. "Good delivery, Chris," said Marcus Williams, patting him lightly on the shoulder. "This is going to pay off." Pay off. The word echoed in Chris's mind. He went back to his dressing room, the small claustrophobic space with that smell of cheap perfume and paper. He picked up his cell phone, opened Twitter. His social media team had already posted the clip with the caption, "Chris Broussard, Kevin Durant's worst nightmare is happening." The numbers began to rise. Retweets, comments, views. Chris should have been happy. After all, that was what he wanted, wasn't it? Attention, relevance, people talking about him. But there was something different this time. A discomfort that settled slowly, like moisture penetrating a wall. He scrolled through the comments. Most agreed with him. Some disagreed. And then a tweet appeared from Kevin Durant himself. Chris's blood ran cold. "I see a little exaggeration there, my friend. My worst nightmare? Are you sure that's the worst that can happen?" 3 question marks. Polite, direct, but devastating. Chris read and reread. That tone, it wasn't aggressive, it was worse. It was disappointed. It was someone saying, "I expected more from you." You can perceive that there is a brutal difference between being challenged and being corrected with class, can't you? Chris's phone began to vibrate. Messages, calls, everyone wanting to know his response. Everyone waiting for the next round of the confrontation. But Chris was standing still, looking at that tweet. And for the first time in hours, perhaps for the first time in months, he wondered, what have I just done? Big mistakes don't come announced, did you know that? They arrive disguised as opportunities. Chris Broussard had just committed one. And the worst part? He still didn't know the size of the avalanche he had started to come down. On the other side of the country, in Oakland, Kevin Durant was looking at his cell phone in the living room of his house. His calf wrapped, the ice slowly melting in the thermal bag next to the couch. He had seen the program. He had heard every word. and something inside him had stirred. It wasn't anger exactly. It was tiredness. Tiredness of people talking about him as if they knew him, as if they understood his journey, as if they had the right to narrate his most intimate thoughts. But Kevin had responded with elegance, with restraint, with the maturity of someone who doesn't need to shout to be heard. He put the cell phone aside and looked out the window. San Francisco Bay sparkled in the distance. The silence of the house was almost therapeutic, after all the noise of the world out there. Kevin Durant didn't know it yet, but that moment, that simple and polite response, was just the beginning. Because sometimes, when you establish a limit with respect, you don't imagine that the other person is going to insist on crossing it again. And Chris Broussard was about to do exactly that. How is it possible that a simple tweet of 3 lines can wound the ego of a man for hours on end? Chris Broussard discovered the answer that night. Sitting on the couch of his house in Los Angeles, the television on some channel that he wasn't even paying attention to, Chris scrolled Twitter compulsively. The bluish glow of the screen illuminated his face in the darkness of the room. Outside, the city vibrated with its characteristic nocturnal energy. But inside that house, there was only silence and growing discomfort. Kevin Durant's tweet had over 50,000 likes. The comments were a chaotic mixture. Some defended Chris. Others laughed at him. But the majority agreed with Kevin. He's right, Broussard exaggerated. KD kept it classy and still destroyed him. Imagine saying that it's someone's worst nightmare. How dramatic. It is impossible not to feel when the tide of public opinion turns against you, isn't it true? It's like being on a beach and realizing, too late, that the water has already covered your feet and is rising fast. Chris placed the cell phone in his lap and rubbed his face with both hands. The rough texture of stubble scratched his palms. He was tired, but it wasn't physical tiredness. It was something deeper, more corrosive. He had been corrected, publicly, and in a way that left no room for debate. His wife, Amanda Foster, came into the room carrying a cup of tea. The steam rose in slow spirals, bringing that comforting smell of chamomile. "Are you still on this?" she asked, her voice filled with gentle concern. "He made me look like an idiot," Chris muttered, his eyes still fixed on the screen. "No," Amanda corrected, sitting beside him. "You made yourself look like an idiot by saying you know the most intimate thoughts of someone you barely talk to. Truth hurts differently when it comes from someone who loves you, doesn't it? It doesn't come with anger. It comes with that calm honesty that cuts deeper than any public criticism." Chris turned to her. "I needed to say something strong, something that would grab attention. That's how it works now." "And it worked," Amanda responded, taking a sip of tea. "Just not the way you expected." She stood up, kissed the top of his head, and went to the bedroom. Chris stayed there, alone again with his thoughts, and that cell phone that seemed to pulse with silent accusations. Have you ever wondered why it's so difficult to simply accept that we made a mistake? Because accepting a mistake is accepting vulnerability. And vulnerability, in the world of sports media, is perceived as weakness. So, instead of accepting, Chris began to build a defense, a justification, a way to transform that embarrassing moment into something that would save him. And that's when the idea emerged. Dangerous. More dangerous than the first. If he proved that he did have a close relationship with Kevin Durant, then his opinion would be validated, right? If he showed the world that he regularly talked to KD, that he had direct access to him, then all that he said wouldn't be exaggeration. It would be privileged insight. Big mistakes are made when we try to fix smaller mistakes. Did you know that? The next morning, Chris woke up with renewed determination. That feeling of being challenged had transformed into something different, into fuel, into motivation to prove his point. He had an appearance scheduled on the Undisputed program with Skip Bayless and Shannon Sharpe. It was a perfect opportunity. The FS1 studio had that characteristic energy of live programs, cameras moving, producers talking into earpieces, lights being adjusted. Robert Kim, the production director, greeted Chris with a firm handshake. "Hey, Chris, ready to talk about your viral moment?" Robert said with a smile that had a touch of irony. "More than ready," Chris responded, but his voice had a tension that he tried to hide. The program began. Skip Bayless, always theatrical, brought up the subject immediately. "Chris, Kevin Durant responded you on Twitter yesterday. What do you have to say?" And that's when Chris made the second mistake. "Look," he began, leaning forward with that posture of someone about to reveal a secret. "Kevin and we have a relationship. I'm not exaggerating when I say that. We talk. We exchange messages. And when I say messages, I'm talking about long conversations. Hours, literally. 2, 3 hours in a row talking. You can perceive that sometimes, in the attempt to prove that we're right, we end up digging an even deeper hole, can't you?" "So, you have his number?" Shannon Sharpe asked, with that characteristic skepticism. "We exchange messages regularly." Chris deflected slightly, but with confidence. "It's a relationship of mutual respect. I analyze his game. He gives me feedback. That's how it works when you've been in this business as long as I have." The conversation continued. Chris elaborated, added details, built a narrative of closeness and access. And with each word, he sank deeper. When the program ended, Chris felt relieved. Yes, relieved. He had reaffirmed his credibility. He had shown that he wasn't just another commentator throwing opinions to the wind. He had sources. He had access. He had everything, except the truth. That same afternoon, in Oakland, Kevin Durant was in the rehabilitation gym at the Warriors training facility. The smell of sweat and rubber equipment filled the air. His physical therapist, Tyler Brooks, guided him through exercises for his calf. Each movement was careful, measured, painful in a different way from game pain. Kevin's cell phone vibrated on the bench next to him. He looked. It was a Twitter notification. Several, actually. EKD Tray 5. "Chris Broussard said you guys talk for hours. Is that true?" "IKD Tray 5 Broussard saying he has your number. Does that check out?" Kevin stopped the exercise. Tyler noticed the change in his expression. "Everything okay?" Tyler asked. Kevin picked up the cell phone. He searched for the program clip, and he watched. "We exchange messages. Hours in a row talking." Kevin's jaw contracted. It wasn't anger. It was something closer to disappointment. Disappointment at seeing someone doubling down on an exaggeration instead of simply admitting they had gone too far. "This guy," Kevin muttered to himself. Tyler waited. He had known Kevin for years. He knew when it was time to talk, and when it was time to just let silence do its work. Kevin typed some words, erased, typed again. He was calibrating. Didn't want to be disrespectful. Didn't want to be aggressive. But he also wasn't going to let that lie go unanswered. Finally, he tweeted, "Cap, cap, 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 cap. You don't have my number. Mananan." Simple, direct, devastating. Cap was slang for lie. And Kevin didn't just say it once, he said it 5 times. And then, to remove any doubt, he made it clear, "You don't have my number." The internet exploded. Within minutes, the tweet had tens of thousands of interactions. Memes began to appear, GIFs of people being exposed, screenshots with red circles around the words, "You don't have my number." And at the center of all that digital storm, Chris Broussard felt his stomach drop. He was in his home office when he saw it. The room was small, filled with books about basketball, framed photos with players, journalism trophies, symbols of a career built on credibility. And now, with a tweet of 5 words, all of that was being questioned. His phone exploded. Marcus Williams called. Robert Kim sent a message. Colleagues, friends, even people he hadn't spoken to in years were wanting to know. Was it true? Had he lied about having Kevin Durant's number? Chris tried to defend himself. He recorded a video from his car, parked somewhere random in Los Angeles, the camera shaking, his face tense under the natural light coming through the windshield. "Look, when I say messages, I'm talking about DMs, direct messages from Instagram, from Twitter. It's all the same thing nowadays, right? It's not different from a text message." But as he spoke, there was something in his eyes that everyone could see. There was the recognition that he had been caught, that he had exaggerated, that he had, yes, inflated a casual relationship into something much bigger than it really was. It is impossible not to notice when someone is trying to justify the unjustifiable, is it? Body language gives it away. Tone of voice gives it away. The excessive need for explanation gives it away. That night, Chris Broussard posted a long tweet. He tried to explain. He tried to contextualize. He said he had over 60 messages from Kevin Durant over the last year, that he wouldn't expose the conversations out of respect. But the damage was done. Kevin Durant, on the other side of the country, read that and simply turned off his phone. He had done what he needed to do. He had established a limit. He had corrected a false narrative. And he had done it without descending to the level of personal attacks or aggression. He had simply told the truth. And sometimes, the truth told with simplicity is the most powerful weapon that exists, don't you think? Big lessons are learned in moments of maximum humiliation. And Chris Broussard was about to have the biggest lesson of his career. Have you ever felt that moment when you realize that everyone is looking at you, but not in the way you wanted? Chris Broussard had been living that moment for 3 straight days. The memes didn't stop. Cap, 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 cap had become a viral phrase. No matter what Chris posted, no matter what he said on any program, the comments were all variations of the same thing. "You don't have his number, Chris." It was Wednesday morning. Chris was sitting in his kitchen, a cup of coffee cooling between his hands. The morning light came through the window, that California brightness that should have been comforting, but which, at that moment, seemed only to expose every dark corner of his thoughts. The silence of the house was heavy. Amanda had left early for work. The kids were at school. It was just him and the crushing weight of public embarrassment. It is impossible not to feel when you have become the joke of the moment. Is it true? It's like being in a crowded room where everyone is laughing, and you know with absolute certainty that they're laughing at you. The phone rang. Marcus Williams, the producer. "Chris, we need to talk about the meeting today." The meeting? Chris had almost forgotten. Monthly meeting at Fox Sports to review numbers, strategies, performance of commentators. "What time again?" Chris asked, his voice sounding tired even to himself. 2 in the afternoon. And Chris, prepare yourself. They're going to want to talk about this. This. The word hung in the air like an unspoken accusation. Chris arrived at the Fox Sports office in Los Angeles at 1:45. The imposing glass building reflected the blue sky in an almost ironic way. Everything outside seemed bright and perfect. Everything inside seemed heavy and complicated. He greeted the receptionist, Jennifer Walsh, who returned him a smile that had a touch of pity. Or maybe it was just his imagination. Maybe everyone now looked at him with pity. The conference room was on the 12th floor. Glass walls, long dark wood table, leather chairs that creaked slightly when you moved. Already there were Marcus Williams, Daniel Patel, the content director, and Sarah Mitchell, the vice president of programming. "Chris, have a seat there," Daniel said, pointing to a chair. His tone was neutral, professional, but there was something in his eyes that Chris recognized immediately. Disappointment. Big, difficult conversations always start with that awkward silence, have you noticed? Those seconds where everyone knows what's going to be said, but nobody wants to be the first to say it. Sarah leaned forward, interlacing her fingers on the table. "Chris, let's get straight to the point. The incident with Kevin Durant has affected your credibility. We're receiving questions from sponsors. We're seeing comments on social media, and they're not good." "I can explain," Chris began, but Daniel raised his hand. "We don't want explanations, Chris. We want to know how you're going to recover your credibility, because that's the most valuable asset a sports journalist has. And now, it's in question." The words hit Chris like punches to the stomach. Each one of them was true. Each one of them hurt exactly because it was true. Marcus Williams, who had always been an ally to Chris, spoke with a kindness that somehow hurt even more. "Chris, you're one of the best analysts we have. But you crossed a line. You inflated a casual professional relationship into something personal and intimate. And when you were exposed, instead of stepping back, you doubled down. That is problematic." You can perceive that the silence that followed was deafening, can't you? It was the silence of an inescapable truth being digested. "I just wanted to be relevant," Chris finally admitted, his voice low. "I felt like I was falling behind, that I needed to do something more, stronger." Sarah sighed. "Chris, you don't need to invent access to be relevant. You need to be honest. You need to be consistent. You need to be trustworthy. Those are the things that build a lasting career. Hot takes and false intimacy with athletes? That builds views for one day and destroys reputations forever." The meeting continued for another 40 minutes. There were no formal punishments. There were no threats. But there was something worse. There was that feeling that he had disappointed people who believed in him. When Chris left that conference room, he felt smaller, lighter, perhaps, from no longer having to carry the weight of denial, but definitely smaller. He drove without direction for a while. The streets of Los Angeles paraded around him in a blur of palm trees, buildings, and blue sky. He eventually stopped at Griffith Park, at an overlook with a view of the city. Sitting on a wooden bench, Chris picked up his cell phone. He opened Twitter. This time, not to see what people were saying about him, but to see Kevin Durant's tweets from the last few days. KD had gone back to posting normally, about basketball, about his rehabilitation, about random subjects that interested him. There was no further reference to the incident. He had said what he needed to say and moved on. That's the difference between someone secure in themselves and someone desperate for validation, isn't it? Someone secure says their truth and moves on. Someone desperate gets stuck in the cycle of justification. Chris thought about his career. 23 years covering the NBA. Interviews with legends. Analysis that was cited in important debates. Genuine relationships with players, coaches, executives. All of that built with hard work, integrity, and honesty. And in 3 days, because of a moment of insecurity, all of that had been tainted. He typed a note in the cell phone notes app. Not to post. Just for himself. Lessons learned. Credibility takes years to build and seconds to destroy. Don't invent access you don't have. When corrected, accept with grace instead of doubling down. Relevance gained through exaggeration is temporary. Respect gained through honesty is lasting. Kevin Durant taught me more about integrity with a 5-word tweet than I learned in years of journalism. How is it possible that sometimes our greatest teachers are the people who humiliate us publicly? That night, Chris had dinner with Amanda. They went to a small, discreet Italian restaurant they had been frequenting for years. The smell of garlic and basil filled the air. Candles flickered on tables. There was something comforting in the normalcy of that place. "You're quieter than usual," Amanda observed, twisting spaghetti on her fork. "I'm thinking," Chris responded, "about everything that happened, about who I've become over the last few years. And who have you become? Someone more concerned with being noticed than with being respected." Amanda put her fork aside and held his hand over the table. "You recognizing that is already half of the change." And she was right. Big transformations start with honest recognition of where we went wrong. Do you agree? Meanwhile, on the other side of the country, Kevin Durant was at home in Oakland. He wasn't thinking about Chris Broussard. He wasn't brooding over the confrontation. He had done what needed to be done and genuinely moved on. He was on the couch, watching a documentary about architecture. His wrapped calf rested on pillows. The ice, religiously applied every 2 hours, kept the inflammation under control. His agent, Anthony Zhang, had called earlier. "You see that Broussard is getting beaten up on social media?" Kevin had responded. "I saw a bit of it." "Are you going to say anything else?" "No. I already said what I needed to." "But you could capitalize on it. Make a joke. Gain more engagement." Kevin had been silent for a moment. Then he said something that perfectly summarized his philosophy. "Anthony, I don't need to destroy anyone to feel good about myself. I corrected a lie. I established a limit. That's enough. It is impossible not to admire when someone has the power to crush another, but chooses simply to stop. Isn't it true?" That was the true victory of Kevin Durant. It wasn't in the viral tweet. It wasn't in the memes. It wasn't in the public humiliation of Chris Broussard. It was in the maturity of knowing when to stop, of understanding that dignity doesn't require the destruction of the other, of recognizing that sometimes the greatest strength lies in restraint. Chris Broussard learned a painful but necessary lesson. Kevin Durant gave a masterclass on how to establish limits with class. And between the two, without them knowing it at that moment, there was a strange form of respect being born. A respect that wouldn't be spoken, wouldn't be celebrated publicly, but that would exist, silent and true, in the weeks and months to come. Big lessons are learned when we swallow our pride and recognize our failures. And Chris Broussard was finally ready to learn. 3 months later. How is it possible that time softens everything, even the most public embarrassments? It was August of 2019. The summer in Los Angeles burned with that characteristic dry heat. Chris Broussard was in his home office, preparing his analysis for the new season. The air conditioning hummed softly. The late afternoon light came through the window. golden and warm. Over the last 3 months, something had changed. Chris didn't perceive it consciously, but his colleagues perceived it. His wife perceived it. Even his followers on social media perceived it. He had become more humble, more measured, less prone to making bombastic statements about things he couldn't really know. When he analyzed players, he talked about what he saw on court. When he discussed decisions, he based them on reported facts, not on supposed intimate conversations. It is impossible not to notice when someone truly learns from their mistakes, is it? The change isn't in the words they say, but in the words they choose not to say. Marcus Williams had commented with him the week before during a planning meeting. "Chris, I don't know if you realize, but your work is better, more solid, more trustworthy." "I learned the hard way," Chris had responded, with a smile that had a touch of lingering shame, but also something new: acceptance. You can perceive that growing sometimes means carrying scars from battles we lost, can't you? That afternoon in August, Chris was preparing a segment on free agency, players changing teams, new potential dynasties forming. It was the most exciting time of year for NBA analysts. His phone vibrated. A Twitter notification. Normally, he would check compulsively. But over the last few months, he had developed a healthier relationship with social media. He checked less. He reacted less. He lived more. But this time, something made him look. It was a mention from Andre Iguodala, teammate of Kevin Durant on the Warriors. "I respect all journalists who can admit when they're wrong and improve their work. It's rare nowadays. But Chris Broussard," Chris read, reread, felt something strange in his chest. It wasn't pride exactly. It was relief. The relief of being seen not for your mistake, but for your evolution. He responded simply, "Thank you, Andre. Still learning every day." Simple, honest, without exaggeration. Big moments of redemption don't come with fanfare. Did you know that? They come in small recognitions, in kind words, in discreet second chances. Meanwhile, in Oakland, Kevin Durant was in the final stages of his rehabilitation. The calf injury had become something more serious during the finals that year. Achilles tendon rupture, surgery, months of recovery. He had signed with the Brooklyn Nets. A new city, a new team, a new journey. He was in the training gym, doing mobility exercises. The smell of sweat and the creaking of equipment were a familiar soundtrack. His new physical therapist, Connor Smith, guided him through careful movements. "How's the feeling?" Connor asked. "Better every day," Kevin responded. And it was true, physically and mentally. The last few months had been reflective, about his career, about his choices, about how he interacted with media and with the public world. The incident with Chris Broussard was a distant memory. Now, not because Kevin had forgotten, but because it simply no longer carried emotional weight. He had said what he needed to, established his limit, and moved on. It is impossible not to admire when someone manages to leave things in the past without rancor, isn't it true? Tyler Brooks, his former physical therapist with the Warriors, had sent a message a few weeks earlier. "You see that Broussard changed his style? He's much more in his lane now." Kevin had responded simply, "Everyone deserves a chance to grow." That was the fundamental difference. Kevin didn't need Chris Broussard to be humiliated forever. Didn't need a public apology. Didn't need anything other than what he had already achieved. The truth being recognized. You can perceive that truly secure people don't need the continued destruction of those who offended them, can't you? In September, something unexpected happened. The NBA was organizing a media conference in New York, an annual event where journalists, analysts, players, and executives gathered to discuss the upcoming season. It was the type of corporate event that everyone attended, but few really wanted to be there. The hotel was luxurious. Marble on the floor, crystal chandeliers, that characteristic smell of new carpet and chilled air conditioning. People in expensive suits circulated with drinks in their hands, doing networking and corporate politics. Chris Broussard was there, representing Fox Sports. He was talking with Daniel Patel about coverage of the new season when he saw, on the other side of the room, Kevin Durant. Chris's heart jumped. Not from fear exactly, but from something. Anxiety, perhaps, or just the uncomfortable memory of how things had ended between them. Kevin was talking to some Nets executives. He was wearing an impeccable navy blue suit. The cane by his side indicated that he was still recovering. But there was something in his posture that radiated quiet confidence. Chris thought about stepping away, about avoiding any possibility of awkward interaction. But then he thought about everything he had learned, about courage, about integrity, about facing the consequences of his actions. How is it possible that the most difficult things to do are often the most necessary? He waited, and eventually, as fate likes to do, Kevin Durant began to walk in his direction. Not intentionally, just the natural flow of the party. People moving, conversations ending, new ones beginning. Their eyes met. There was a moment, just a second, where everything could have gone in any direction. And then Kevin Durant did something surprising. He nodded, a simple nod. Brief, but unequivocally an acknowledgement. Chris reciprocated, also with a nod, also brief. They didn't speak. They didn't approach each other. They didn't exchange hugs or handshakes. In that nod of the head, there was something more profound than words. The mutual recognition of two people who had been on opposite sides of a public moment, but who, now, with time and distance, could exist in the same space with dignity intact. Kevin continued walking. Chris remained where he was, and the party continued around them as if nothing had happened. But something had happened. Respect had been established. It is impossible not to feel when a situation finally finds its natural closure, is it? It doesn't need to be dramatic. It doesn't need to be verbalized. Just resolved. Later that night, Chris was in his hotel room. The view of New York glittered through the window, millions of lights blinking in a chaotic but beautiful dance. He called Amanda. "How was it?" she asked. "I saw Kevin Durant." "And?" We greeted each other, with our heads. It was enough. Amanda laughed softly on the other end of the line. "You've grown, Chris. For real." And he had. Not in the way he imagined when everything started, not through victories or public validation, but through forced humility, through public embarrassment that forced him to look in the mirror and not like what he saw, and then, slowly and painfully, become someone better. Have you ever noticed that sometimes the greatest blessings come disguised as the worst humiliations? Kevin Durant, on the plane back to Brooklyn that same night, also thought about that brief encounter. Not deeply, not obsessively, just a passing reflection. He had learned a lot in recent years about establishing limits, about saying no, about correcting false narratives, and more importantly, about knowing when to stop. He could have destroyed Chris Broussard completely. Of course. He could have made continuous jokes. Absolutely. He could have turned that man into an eternal meme. But he didn't. Because Kevin Durant had learned something that many people take a lifetime to understand. True strength is not in destroying those who offend you. It's in establishing your point with clarity, and then moving on with your dignity intact. Great men are not defined by how they treat those who admire them, but by how they treat those who test them. Do you agree? 3 months after that encounter, in December of 2019, Chris Broussard was in the Fox Sports studio. He was analyzing the new season, talking about Kevin Durant's game, who still hadn't returned to the court because of his injury. Kevin Durant is one of the 5 best players of this generation, Chris said, his voice firm but without exaggeration. And when he returns, I have no doubt he'll still be elite, but time will tell. As I always say now, I analyze what I see, not what I imagine athletes are feeling. Marcus Williams, watching from the control room, smiled. That last sentence, that small disclaimer, it was the living proof that Chris had indeed learned. Sarah Mitchell, who was also watching, turned to Daniel Patel. He's back, not as he was, better. And it was true. Chris Broussard hadn't gone back to what he was before. He had become something different, something more authentic, less concerned, with seeming like an insider, more focused on being good at what he did. You can perceive that sometimes we lose a version of ourselves to find a better one, can't you? The months passed. Chris Broussard continued his work at Fox Sports, but something fundamental had changed in him. Fewer hot takes, more substance, less false intimacy, more respect. Kevin Durant recovered from his injury and began a new chapter in Brooklyn. He moved forward, as he always had, without rancor, without need for posthumous victories over those who had tested him. Years later, if someone asked Chris about that moment, he would answer, "It was the worst and best moment of my career. It destroyed me and rebuilt me." And if someone asked Kevin, he would shrug. Sometimes you have to tell the truth, even when it's uncomfortable. 2 different perspectives, 2 different lessons. A mutual respect, born from confrontation and matured by time. And perhaps, in the end, that was exactly what mattered.